On the warm summer morning of July 8th, 1853, a man stepped out upon the deck of the American steam frigate, the USS Susquehanna, and gazed intensely at the choppy waves and the low fog retreating into the distance. Alongside him were three other frigates, the Saratoga, Mississippi, and Plymouth. As the mist slowly faded, the man began to discern precipitous bluffs and rising cliffs, adorned by strange, exotic houses and grandiose white forts of wood and stone. This man was Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry, whose squadron of ships just began to sail into the waters of the Bay of Edo. His reason for being here was of utmost importance, bearing a letter handwritten by the President of the United States, and sought to make landfall without delay, insisting, even if it meant he had to use force. Upon arriving at the shores of Edo later that day, Commodore Perry and his men stood in awe as they observed the native people and their surroundings. These people, their attire, their residences, their transportation, their weaponry, all struck the men with a profound realization. A realization that they had, shockingly, stumbled into a civilization seemingly suspended in history, frozen in time for nearly 200 years. To understand this stasis of innovation, we must rewind centuries prior to Commodore Perry's expedition, back to 15th century Japan. At this time, Japan was in a tumultuous and decentralized condition. This era is referred to as the Sengoku period, or the Age of the Warring States, which began in 1467 as a result of the Onin War, which collapsed government authority. Furthermore, Japan was propelled into numerous bloody civil wars between around 300 smaller domains, whose leaders, called daimyo, controlled armies of the famous samurai. A century later, in the late 16th century, the daimyo Oda Nobunaga was the first to modernize his military with revolutionary European firearms. He conquered the weak army of the remaining government and other opposing daimyo until he successfully brought much of central Honshu, Japan's largest island, under his control. After his death in 1582 due to a rebel insurrection, one of Nobunaga's top generals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, rose to power to avenge his daimyo by vanquishing the rebels. Over the following decade, it was Hideyoshi that accomplished Nobunaga's goal, and finally, by 1591, Japan was unified. Over the following years, Hideyoshi would attempt two failed invasions into Korea, up until his death due to illness in 1598. A void of power was created among the vassal generals, and Japan was plunged into infighting once more. 2 years later, at the Battle of Sekigahara, the daimyo Tokugawa Ieyasu defeated the opposing forces and secured his new leadership. In 1603, he was granted the title of shogun, a military ruler more powerful than the emperor. Tokugawa Ieyasu's ascension ushered in the Edo period, under the rule of the newfound Tokugawa shogunate. Under the newly proclaimed shogunate, some problems came to Ieyasu's attention that threatened the very peace he created. As European trade increased, Christian missionaries began to convert parts of Japan. Fearing subversion due to Christian ideologies, which could uproot the newly stabilized government, as well as invasion from the Europeans, Ieyasu banned the religion in 1614, and suppressed and persecuted them out of Japanese lands, until his death in 1616. Ieyasu's grandson, Tokugawa Iemitsu, introduced the Closed Country Edict of 1635, which stated that Japanese ships are strictly forbidden to leave for foreign countries, and if any Japanese returns from overseas after residing there, he must be put to death. Christianity and Western literature were punishable by death, and this culminated in Japan being cut off from the rest of the world. The Tokugawa shogunate did bring stability and peace throughout the region for the next 200 years, but this all changed on July 8, 1853, when one Commodore Matthew Perry sailed with his squadron into the Bay of Edo and forced Japan to open up to trade with the United States, threatening to return with more ships if they didn't comply. Upon Commodore Perry's return the following spring, Japan had no choice but to agree, and America obtained commercial rights with the country, which was soon followed by other European countries. For the next few years, internal discontent grew due to the shogun's submission to Western powers, and many dormant samurai and citizens began to take a pro-imperial and anti-foreign view under the slogan, "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians." Governmental political violence was demonstrated all over the cities of Kyoto and Edo, and many revolutionaries were oppressed and executed. Many of these rebels came from the Western alliance of the Satsuma and Choshu clans, who sought to bring the emperor back to power. They began training and modernizing their samurai armies, and tensions rose as the new shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, made a failed attempt to crush the rebellion. With the shogunate on its last legs, in 1868 the rebel forces captured Kyoto, and Yoshinobu resigned from power to save himself from assassination. Thus, the Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown, and Emperor Meiji was declared the imperial ruler. However, Yoshinobu didn't resign for long, and he prepared his troops for another attack, beginning the Boshin War a few months later, which was quickly crushed because of the military superiority of the imperial court. Emperor Meiji moved imperial rule from Kyoto to Edo, which was renamed to Tokyo. With imperial power finally restored, Emperor Meiji and his cabinet of advisors set out to develop their nation. They paid the remaining daimyo off to retirement, turning their domains into imperial prefectures. The feudal system was abolished and replaced with an oligarchy. A new currency was established, which greatly stabilized the economy. Now wielding a steady income, the government focused on infrastructure, creating railway systems, factories, and telegraph lines. The education system was reworked and literacy rates flourished. The country had begun to completely change, industrializing and implementing centuries worth of advancements in mere decades. The government also began to focus on their military and created a Western-style conscript army with 3 years of mandatory service. Samurai insurrections occurred throughout Western Japan as they feared for their own continuity. These revolts were quickly put down, wiping out the samurai class from Japan almost entirely. Japan had now become an industrial powerhouse and was determined to become on par with Western powers. In 1894, the Japanese regained interest in the Korean peninsula under control of the Chinese, and initiated the First Sino-Japanese War a few months later, in which Japan's new tactics and modern weaponry allowed for their swift victory 8 months later. As a result, the Korean peninsula gained sovereignty, and Taiwan and the Liaotung Peninsula were given to Japan. However, due to European interest in China, Japan was pressured to return the Liaotung Peninsula. Following this, China was persuaded to transfer the peninsula to Russian control. This outraged the Japanese, and in the next few years tensions rose until the spark of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, ending in 1905, with a Japanese victory. The defeat of a major European power by Japan shocked the world, as other countries became wary of Japanese power. Imperial Japanese military and naval strength only grew, along with ultra-nationalist ideologies, creating a snowball effect in which Japan reached their height of power in 1942, a year after the bombing of the American naval base, Pearl Harbor. From a fear of Western colonization and determination to restore imperial power, Japan obtained and implemented 2.5 centuries worth of knowledge in just 4 decades, transforming the country to an industrialized powerhouse and setting up the path for Japanese imperialism and expansion in the 20th century. The once formidable samurai class faded into history as Japan embraced new technology and tactics, which led to widespread victories in China, Korea, and eventually most of the Western Pacific.